is looking at U.S.-China relations at the beginning of the Bush administration. It's a wonderful topic. The U.S.-China relations are at the very center of our foreign policy, extraordinarily important. And of course, the Bush administration's evolution is becoming interesting as well, and certainly timely. Our guest, Professor David Michael Lampton, is one of the nation's foremost China authorities. We're absolutely delighted that he's with us this evening. He's a graduate of Stanford University. His Bachelor of Arts was achieved with great distinction and honors, and he's a member of Phi Beta Kappa from that distinguished institution. He also received his master's and PhD degrees from Stanford. He taught at Ohio State University for 13 years approximately. Toward the end of that tenure at Ohio State, he also worked for the National Academy of Sciences and ran the China Policy Program for American Enterprise Institute. He then, for 9 or 10 years, was the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, a very, very old and distinguished organization. They've brought many exchange scholars and individuals from China. Their invitation to the ping pong team was probably the best known of their many worthy acts. As you know, Professor Lampton is now with Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he's the George and Sadie Hyman Professor. He also is director of the China Studies Program there, and in addition is the director of the China Studies Program at the Nixon Center in Washington. He's also, connected to the Hopkins position, presently co-chair of the Research Institute at Hopkins Nanjing, obviously in China. He's done all the things you're supposed to do. He's published in great journals, wonderful articles, and has also written for the elite media of the United States. And if you haven't read what he's written, you have to have seen him on television at one time or another, no matter what time of the day you watch. He's been on the Today Show, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Charlie Rose, for you later types, and Moneyline, so among others. But in any case, he certainly is a widely known authority. Let me mention, in reference to tonight's topic, just a couple of the titles of his publications. He co-edited or edited The Making of Chinese Foreign and Security Policy in the Reform Era, 1978 to 2000. He has written a book which is here, which is entitled, it's a wonderful title, Same Bed, Different Dreams, Managing U.S.-China Relations, 1989 to 2000. And for the Nixon Center, looking ahead in 1999, he was co-author of Managing U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century, and more recently, A Big Power Agenda for East Asia, America, China, and Japan. As I say, that too for the Nixon Center. We're absolutely delighted to have such a distinguished student of China and U.S.-China relations with us this evening. It's my great pleasure to present to you Professor David Michael Lampton.
Well, that was a very generous introduction, and my dad would have been proud, I guess, is the cliche, and my mother would believe it. But in any case, it's good to be here. I'm glad Frank had the foresight to close the blinds so I'm not totally distracted by the beautiful harbor here in Baltimore. Also, as you were reciting Stanford, I was thinking how happy I am to be associated with Johns Hopkins. It's absolutely a world-class university, and you should be proud to have it in your city. I was asked to speak about U.S.-China relations in the early Bush administration. And in all fairness, this is a work in progress. And this isn't peculiar to the Bush administration, as I'll try to explain. The U.S.-China relationship is an extraordinarily difficult relationship for both the Americans and Chinese to manage. But every administration out of the last 6, anyways, had substantial difficulty. So while we're focused on the Bush administration, I don't want to create a misapprehension that their difficulties are totally unparalleled and have no precursors in history. It's a difficult relationship, and it's easy for academics that spend 24 hours a day thinking about one problem to seem hypercritical. Rest assured that if all the China experts were managing policy, we'd still have difficulties, and we'd be backing and forthing and calibrating our actions depending on China's reactions. So I don't want it to seem that I'm picking on the administration. I was simply given the current situation to talk about, and I will try to do so. I think it's always useful in assessing what somebody has to say. Well, what's your experience here? What are your data points? What have you drawn your conclusions from? And beyond my longer experience with the topic, recently I've got 3 data points that I'd like to just describe for you. First of all, I spent the last 3 years working on this book on managing U.S.-China relations, expecting a new administration to come along because Mr. Clinton was not going to have a 3rd term by constitutional fiat, if nothing else. And therefore, we had to look ahead to a transition, and I thought it might be very useful to look at the preceding 2 administrations, the Clinton administration and its predecessor, the Bush 1 administration, and say what difficulties did they have with the relationship and what lessons can we learn from those difficulties that might be helpful to a new administration. So certainly I've thought about this issue of transition and policy problems for at least the last 3 years in some detail. Secondly, in March, I went to China with former Secretary Kissinger and former Defense Secretary Perry, and we met with Chinese leaders, and not only just leaders, but also students and other Chinese. And I will convey some of the conclusions I had from those meetings. And then more recently, I went to Taiwan and Hong Kong for the Department of State, and so I've just returned not long ago from Hong Kong and Taiwan, which I sort of conceptually refer to as Greater China without getting involved in all of the, let us say, nomenclature problems of whether it's the Republic of China or Taiwan or so on. But certainly in terms of American foreign policy and thinking about China, you need to think about the PRC, the People's Republic of China, but Hong Kong and Taiwan. And the final thing just happened today, and that is that the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pew Center for the Press released a poll on American attitudes towards foreign policy, but several of the questions dealt with China. And luckily, I became aware of that early this morning and could factor that in. So the views I'm going to share with you are both my more academic analysis, plus my recent interaction in Greater China, plus some of the polling results that just have come out today. I would say if you're thinking about just the impressions I drew from my trip to Hong Kong and Taiwan and the Asian region, and they are looking at the Bush administration, trying to understand where is this administration headed in its policy towards China. China is the most important foreign policy issue for many of our friends in Asia, because China's 1.2 billion people, the most rapidly growing major economy in the world today, and it's very close to our Asian friends and allies. So they're very concerned how the United States, and particularly a new administration, is going to handle this most important of all relationships from their viewpoint. And I would say that the concerns that some of our Asian friends and allies have we should take them seriously. I was disconcerted by the worries that many of our Asian friends have about the initial thrust of the Bush administration policy. I should say, in all fairness, the Bush administration is seeing this quite rapidly, and I believe that what's unfolding is a process of adjustment. And as I'll try and explain in greater detail how that policy is being adjusted. But when I was in Asia about a month ago, I think many of our friends were very concerned about a number of things. One is what they saw as the unilateralism of American policy, that we weren't consulting with them. Of course, consulting in Asian and particularly Confucian societies is a very important process. And they saw the United States at the apogee of its economic, military, cultural power. And they are afraid they were seeing an America that wasn't paying very much attention to what others thought. That's a problem for us in the region if we want cooperation. That's the first thing. A second thing that I think our friends in Asia were concerned about, particularly with respect to our China policy, is a fear that the United States might adopt a confrontational policy towards China and force our friends in Asia to choose between an economically and strategically important United States and a very close and big China. They do not want to have to choose between the United States and China. They have too many things at stake with both of those countries. They want us to get along if that's at all possible. Now, all our friends also have worries about China, and we can talk about that in the question and answer. So they're not simplistic, but they want us to get along. Thirdly, I came away from particularly the trip with Dr. Kissinger and Secretary Perry convinced, and I am convinced, that the Chinese leadership, the last thing on earth they want right now is a conflictual relationship with the United States. They need the next 10 to 20 years of a relatively benign international environment so they can focus on economic development and maintaining political stability. Every hour they spend on conflict with the United States or devoting their attention to the external environment is an hour they don't have to deal with the problems of China. And I've always felt, I just thank my lucky stars that I'm not a leader of China. I don't know how, given the domestic agenda of problems, stability, poverty, disease, educating, managing a rural to urban migration that the Chinese are managing, how they do it. And so anyway, the strong view I have is China's leaders definitely do not want a conflict with the United States if it can be avoided. Now, there are people in China that aren't sure that it can be avoided. There are people who want to reunify with Taiwan sooner rather than later, preferably peacefully, but maybe militarily if that's what it takes. So I don't mean all views in China are benign or in American interests. That's not true. But the long and the short of it is, I think that we will have to push the Chinese leadership very hard to end up in a conflict with them. And we should avoid doing that, in my view. And finally, I think that we often see China's leaders as weak. They're not Mao Zedong. They're not even Deng Xiaoping. Most people can't even tell you who China's leaders are. They sort of seem to be faceless technocrats, perhaps. But the long and the short of it is, this leadership, I think, gets a bum rap in the sense that it has made some very difficult decisions for them. They just last Friday have reached agreement with the United States on the terms of entry into WTO. This is going to unemploy tens of millions of people in China. It's going to make China in the long run more competitive economically. And in the long run, we're going to face a dynamic power. That'll be good for us, but it'll also be disconcerting. And there'll be certain constituencies here that will be hurt by that more dynamic entity. But in the short run, it's going to be China that pays the price. And a weak leadership that didn't look to the future would not have been willing to pay the price to join WTO. This is a leadership that, in short, I think is willing to take risks. So those were some of the kind of broad brush conclusions that I came away with. Now, I mentioned just at the opening that a very interesting poll on U.S.-China relations came out. or was actually on American attitudes towards foreign policy, and a few questions dealt with China. I thought it was very interesting because this poll was taken after the recent, what I will call reconnaissance plane incident, what the press refers to as the spy plane incident. And so it was after that. And what is interesting are about three pieces of data that I think are very useful in thinking both about what President Bush must be thinking and his administration doing and American attitudes. The first thing that's very interesting is that only about 20% of Americans now view China as an adversary, quote unquote, or threat. What is interesting about that 20% number is it's relatively low, and you would have thought after the reconnaissance plane incident it would have been higher. But what's even more interesting is that 20% number of Americans who see China as a threat or adversary has been pretty constant for a number of years. It hasn't changed that much. And this leads me to a point that as I've spoken around the country, I find that American attitudes on China are often much more sensible and balanced than the discussion that goes on inside the Beltway 30 miles down the road. That is to say, most Americans, I think, when they look at China, and I was involved in some focus group research, if given the choice of evaluating our relations with China as friend, enemy, or problem, opportunity, Americans almost always choose the problem opportunity. China's a problem for us, it's an opportunity. How do you manage the problem so we maximize the opportunity? That's the common sense American kind of framework. But when you listen to our national debate, at least in Congress and in politicized environments, it gets transformed into a friend-enemy issue. Is China the next threat looming out there in a strategic sense? Well, this public opinion poll that was just released today by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pew Center kind of reconfirms, at least in my view, this notion that the Americans are not sort of frothing at the mouth with a fear that China is the next great threat. A problem, it could be an adversary off in some future, but that's not the way we ought to be treating it now. Second, very interesting, and I thought common sense conclusion of this poll was the respondents saw China as less of a problem than the following things. First of all, weapons of mass destruction in unreliable hands, usually numero uno problem. Drugs, illicit drugs, infectious diseases, HIV among them, and Iraq and Saddam Hussein as bigger problems than China. I think that's very interesting after the reconnaissance plane incident. And we may want to have more questions. I'm glad there's a lot to be said about the reconnaissance plane that I won't even touch on. The final thing is very interesting, and that is people were asked about their willingness to commit to the defense, militarily commit to the defense of Taiwan. And actually these results are very consistent with polls that have been done, but most recently in 1999, as I recall, by the Luce Foundation. In any case, only 25% of Americans say we should commit to Taiwan's defense. 66%, or about two-thirds, say we should not commit. Now, I don't want to draw the conclusion that the American people, if Taiwan was attacked in an unprovoked manner, would just wash their hands of it and say, well, it's only an island. I don't think we would. I think we would, in fact, there'd be a rally around the flagpole effect, and we would probably end up involved. But what I find interesting is the Americans have a limited idea of the nature of the commitment that we have in Taiwan. This would be a very divisive issue if the U.S. ended up in a military protracted conflict involving Taiwan in China. So what I'm going to say takes all of these data points, my own experiences, conclusions, public opinion, and I want to just address a few issues before I open it up to questions. But the big bottom line is that I think, A, the Chinese leadership does not want a confrontational relationship with the United States, and I think the United States people don't want a confrontational relationship with China. Neither is convinced they can necessarily work that out That's a separate issue. But you do not have two populations, and nor do I believe leaderships that actually want conflict. That's an important positive fact. It may not determine everything. Now, I always think it's interesting and important to look back a little and get perspective. It's sort of, when you're in the middle of a typhoon, it's kind of hard to think about the clear weather that might only be a mile or two away from the middle of the storm that you're in. But if you kind of keep that historic perspective, the difficulties you have at the current moment seem to maybe be put in a little more manageable light. And I think it's useful in thinking about U.S.-China relations in the Bush administration. And I think they've had a lot of problems. Some are bad luck, and some are maybe a little misstep in one direction or another. But the point is, every administration we've had for the last 6 administrations had an opening gambit with China that was difficult. If we look at President Carter, he sent Secretary Vance to China in 1977, hoped to push relations forward. The result was, I don't want to say a debacle, that's a little overstatement, but let's put it this way. Secretary Vance did not have a good trip to China. That, I think, is an eminently fair characterization. President Bush won. The first place he went after Emperor Hirohito died in the opening couple of weeks of the administration of Bush 1, he went to the funeral for Hirohito, but immediately went to China. It was his real first visit for diplomatic purposes abroad. It was within 4 or 5 weeks of his inauguration. President Bush 1 had a very deep and personal experience with China. One of his children was christened in China. He and Barbara rode bicycles around Beijing. It was one of the happiest periods of their life, just in a very personal sense. So when Tiananmen happened, President Bush said, you know, this relationship's personal to me. I'm going to manage it. You know, it's very unusual for a president to pluck out one relationship and pay such detailed attention as he did. But even as committed as he was to that relationship, immediately, even on his trip, he ran into a major problem where the Chinese didn't want an astrophysicist, a man named Feng Li-Zhi, to come to a dinner. They literally prevented Mr. Feng and his guests from coming, and it created quite a diplomatic row. And then, of course, Tiananmen came along. Clinton had basically, I'd want to qualify it if I had time, but basically he didn't have a workable China policy for 3.5 years. It took him 3.5 years to get into what I think he would describe as a sustainable, productive mode with China. And so now President Bush, too, comes in a long, distinguished history, follows on his predecessors having difficulty. So, first point is, just because I'm going to talk about Bush's difficulties doesn't imply he's the only one. This administration, like I think a lot of administrations, maybe most administrations, particularly when you change parties, in our adversarial political system, you have to explain to the voters why they ought to change out of some mode they're comfortable with. And the general argument of insurgents against the incumbent party is, I'm not going to be like them. And you try and find as many areas to differentiate yourself in the mind of the voter from the other guy. And China policy, for whatever set of reasons, has become a very favorite kind of flagellation device to differentiate how you're going to be different than your predecessor. And certainly President Clinton was subject to some charges on China in our political domain. He came in his first term talking about the butchers of Beijing and human rights first, second, and third, and I'm going to link trade to human rights. And then he found out it didn't work, and he did a U-turn, and by certainly his second administration, he had a policy that was very much like Bush 1. So, of course, when the Republicans come along, they accuse Mr. Clinton of flip-flopping on policy, putting economics first, downplaying human rights. A very predictable set of accusations. In particular, the Bush administration had a bill, what I would call a bill of particulars of things they didn't like about Mr. Clinton's Asia policy in general, in particular his China policy. First of all, he believed that, and I think President Bush and his advisors, I'll speak as though they're one big blob, but in fact they're highly differentiated. But one of the Bush II critiques of the Clinton administration was that we treated our ally Japan with insufficient importance and deference, and we, in fact, paid too much attention to China. So they wanted to change the balance. Now, my own view has been we're capable as a big nation of walking and chewing gum at the same time. We ought to be able to treat Japan right and deal with China as an important country. But in our polarized political debate, we have to seem to set one off against the other. So treat Japan more important, to downplay, downgrade China. And this was reflected initially when foreign Vice Premier Chen Shih-chung was going to come. He was originally going to see President Bush on a given day, but then Prime Minister Mori had to come, so we pushed the Chinese down the agenda line and the Japanese up. It's taken a number of both important manifestations of this and more trivial. Another bill of critique on this bill of particulars is that Mr. Clinton paid too much attention to economics and trade and not enough to security. And we're going to pay more attention to security, read military issues with China and China's growth as a power and what that means for American interests. A third indictment on this bill of particulars was that the Clinton administration was too ambiguous in its commitment to defend Taiwan. We are going to be clear. If Taiwan is attacked, we are going to be there, was the sentiment. And a few weeks back, you may remember, an ABC News morning program, President Clinton said, "I'll do what it takes," meaning in the defense of Taiwan. Now, if I was in the White House looking at these poll results, looking at the fact that only 25% of Americans say they want to commit unequivocally to Taiwan, I'd be thinking about how unequivocal I want it to be. So in any case, Japan more important, less ambiguity about our defense of Taiwan, and upgrade security dimension of our relationship or pay more attention to it, and less attention to the economic relationship. Finally, and this is the thing that stuck most in the Chinese craw, so to speak, is that President Bush, particularly in the campaign, talked about China not as a future partner of the United States. President Clinton and Jiang Zemin, the president of China, when Jiang Zemin came to the United States in late 1997, they issued a statement out of the White House that said the goal of America and China and their relations is to work toward a constructive strategic partnership in the 21st century. It was a future goal. But of course, in our campaign, it got transformed from a future goal into the assertion that President Clinton said we had a partnership with China, which I wouldn't say that, and most people I know wouldn't say that as a description of the relationship, but it was used as a goal. Anyway, President Bush said he looked at it China more as a peer competitor, and the Chinese focus on the word competitor. And competitor in the Chinese view means there's friction, which slides into hostility, which slides into bad things. And so, in any case, not only these specific policy commitments, but President Bush's initial characterization of the relationship was highly worrisome to the Chinese. Now, having said that, and in those regards, and we can in the questions talk about more specific things that have happened, my guess is that the policy is going to change for a number of reasons, and that by the time we certainly get 2 years out, my guess is, we can't be certain, and all sorts of things like planes that crash into one another can change your predictions, but nonetheless, my guess is the policy is going to move back towards both what his father had and President Clinton. It won't be identical. There'll be areas of conflict and difference. Most notably, missile defense might just be one example. So I'm not saying the policy is going to be exactly like Clinton's, but I guess it's going to get back into the main channel of policy for the last 6 administrations. Now, why would I think that? Because if you talk to people now, particularly in the Defense Department, they're not necessarily talking like that. Many of the political people in the White House aren't. But I think there are a number of reasons we can have some degree of confidence that policy is going to be more, if you don't like past policy, my guess is you won't like future policy. If you liked past policy, then you'll have a different attitude about the future. Why might it change? First of all, it gets back to my initial observation about what people were telling me in Asia. They don't want us to have a conflictual relationship with China if it's possible, because if it's possible to avoid, because it forces them to choose sides when they have interests with both of us that they would like to pursue simultaneously. A second reason is that China affects our interests. We don't have, as Dr. Kissinger likes to say, we're not having good relations with China as a favor to them. We have good relations with China because it's in our interests. Now, what are the interests? Well, we all certainly can think of economics. Look right outside in your harbor, and I bet it'd be an interesting to find out how much tonnage of Chinese goods is going through your harbor. You'd probably be surprised. But so we certainly have economic interests. Everybody understands that. But we have others as well. Korea. Remember in 1992, 3-4, we were worried about Korea, North Korea, becoming a nuclear power. Now, that hasn't completely vanished as a worry. I don't mean to say that. But it's a lot more manageable as a problem now. And the reason it's manageable is both because of far-sighted American policy, but also the Chinese don't want a nuclear North Korea at all, either. As one of my very candid Chinese friends said, with friends like the North Koreans, who needs enemies? They've paid a very big price for being close to North Korea over the years. So certainly that would be one example. Proliferation. Now, it's true that China has proliferated technologies of weapons of mass destruction to people we would prefer they not. This is true. And the means of delivery. But the long and the short of it is that it's dawning rather rapidly on the Chinese that proliferating weapons is not only bad for the Americans, it's bad for them. And that's dawning on them rapidly. They're becoming, I think, relatively speaking, significant, at a good pace, more responsible in their export controls, not perfectly responsible. So we have proliferation. Another common interest is, if I'm right, that China's leaders have these tremendous domestic problems they need to pay attention to. They don't want to get alienated from the United States and Japan that are providing big markets and capital for their development. They don't want that. If they end up in a conflict over Taiwan with us, they will alienate themselves from Japan, the United States, and the Western financial world, and they know it. And they don't want to do that in their interest. But when we have good relations with China, it's easier for them to downplay the Taiwan problem. When we have conflictual relations, it drives the Taiwan problem to the center of our relations. And so, in a kind of ironic way, good relations between the United States and the mainland of China, I believe, is also good for the people of Taiwan, who are incidentally pumping money unbelievably rapidly into the mainland themselves. I had thought, prior to my trip to Taiwan, that it would be between $40 and $60 billion Taiwan had invested on the mainland. Very authoritative officials on Taiwan said, no, 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 no. We think it's between 60 and 120 billion US dollars, and we have no idea. But in fact, Taiwan has in effect thrown its financial future on integration, whether the political leaders there or not want it. So we have an important Taiwan interest there. And finally, there are in the little more petty area, things like the UN Human Rights Commission. You know, we're not on the commission anymore. Now, how did that happen? It happened for a lot of reasons, but China worked against us. And we can talk more about why that's the case, and it's not just China. If our European allies had hung with us, we'd still be in the commission. But the point is, we're involved with China in multilateral organizations, from the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Commission, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and if we want to be in an adversarial position with China in every one of those, we can be, but it's not in our interest, at least taken alone. And so I think that's the first thing. We have a lot of interests, and our allies don't want us having a conflictual relationship. And I think we're a basically rational system given enough time. I guess, was it Churchill that said, you Americans are so rational, you do the right thing after you've exhausted every other possibility. But nonetheless, we'll end up there eventually. I think there's another big reason, and that is that the Republican Party, and you may have a different categorization, but the Republican Party is a complicated thing. If any of us were president, it wouldn't be easy getting consensus in the Republican Party today about what to do. There are about three groups in the Republican Party: the security hawks, people most concerned about security and military issues, growth, and so forth. There are what I would call the social issue Republicans, people concerned about religious oppression, which is genuine and severe in China, and human rights related issues, abortion, all of that. And so that's a second group. And then there's what you might just, for simplicity's sake, call the Wall Street Republicans, the Fortune 500, the people with economic strategic view of the world. And in their view, China's the biggest, fastest growing market, and we have to be a player there. I think that's a fair characterization. Well, if you're president in the Republican Party, then which group are you going to play to? Well, it's not an easy choice. But President Bush has done what politicians usually do. They try to say they're going to give all three groups everything they want. Not possible. But the big groups he's tried to placate is to say we are going to toughen up our security policy with China, but we're going to favor doing business with China. That's going to be very hard to do. And he's going to have to choose between better economic relations or poor strategic relations. And my guess is, just a guess, that he in the end, because in the end domestic politics is so key, he's going to go for the economics as the balance. Now, that may be, we can dispute that. We're all talking about something that hasn't happened here. But anyway, he's got a contradiction here, and he may be able to finesse it for a while. But ultimately, he's going to have to choose. And my guess is that the economic relationship will win out. Not totally predominate, but on balance, we're not going to totally alienate the economic relationship to pursue this security concerns unless China changes its behavior, which I said I didn't expect them to do. I could be wrong about that. Another reason I think you're going to see more moderation is partly to do just with the idiosyncrasies of our own system. The Senate just changed. And this is really, the rest of the world, has to marvel at the American Rube Goldberg kind of system here. But the Senate, we have different chairmen now in our committees. Jesse Helms is not head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is very intensely concerned about China. The head of the Intelligence Committee is now Bob Graham from Florida. Very different than Mr. Shelby of Alabama. So we've had some players change here. It doesn't mean they can turn around policy, but the Senate can throw roadblocks in all sorts of things it doesn't like. So there's certainly that. And there are other considerations. That is, China is in a very sensitive stage. It's in effect going into its election cycle, and I don't mean democratic elections, but they're changing from the third generation to the fourth generation. The people who will be leading China 2 years from now are going to be very different people than the people leading China now, I believe. And we'll have our problems. They'll be nationalistic. They're going to want China to play its rightful place and role in the world. It's not going to be easy to deal with. But I think we are going to throw our lot with trying to build good relations to the leaders that are in the pipeline and not totally alienate a generation we're going to have to deal with for the next 20 years. I think that's going to be the strategic kind of view that prevails. So, long and the short of it is that I think we're seeing a new administration. It's taken some, in my view, missteps. That's not all that unusual. But there are some corrective mechanisms here. I believe the administration's beginning to adjust. I'm very heartened that President Bush has said not only is he going to go to Shanghai, the APEC meetings in the fall, but the current plan is he's going on to Beijing for a summit. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The fact that we could move beyond the spy plane incident, I think Americans think 11 days was a long time for Americans to be detained, and certainly if any of us were them, 11 days is a long time. I think the Chinese sort of look at how fast they moved, 11 days in the Chinese time. I think they kind of a little bit surprised at the impatience of Americans. But nonetheless, whatever you think about that incident, we seem to be moving beyond it. And American public opinion seems to have its eye on the ball, which is this is a relationship about problems and opportunities. And hopefully we won't transform it into a problem of friends and enemies. Thank you very much. I've been delegated to spontaneously address your questions, and I'm glad to do so, or disagreements or whatever. Yes, sir. What is the future of communism in China? And I guess I would answer that in two ways. One is communism as an ideology, that is a belief system of a kind of commonality of working class interest that is going to prevail over the needs and demands of capital. In other words, the ideological faith is totally dead. I don't know that I've really met a communist under 70 in China for a long time. Now, I may be meeting the wrong people. I leave myself subject to that charge. But in all seriousness, there's a very good book out called China's New Generation of Leaders, the Fourth Generation, by a man named Chung Li. And he goes into great detail and based on interviews and all sorts of things. And I think it's quite clear that what we now have coming to the fore are technocratic, scientific, economically oriented leaders. And that is the new religion, if you want to put it that, the new faith, if there is one in China, that science is going to offer us a way forward. Now, you might think that's misguided, and in some respects probably is. But nonetheless, communism is a shared ideology and a desire to bring revolution to the rest of the world. It's been dead, I think, over a decade, if not 2 decades. People might want to quibble, but that's my basic view. Now, if you mean organizationally, there is a Communist Party, and it has 60 million people in it. And they do have organizational discipline, and they do arrest members of the Falun Gong, quasi-religious group. They do arrest American Chinese going to China who want to do research. They do arrest political dissidents. They don't allow competitive political parties. They don't allow free trade unions. So organizationally, as a mechanism of control, the Communist Party is very much alive as an authoritarian political party. And in fact, I think the United States makes a mistake if we think that party, it has tremendous problems, internal. And you can see discussion in our analysis of China about all those problems. So I'm not trying to say that Communist Party's without problems. It has huge problems. But on balance, I think it's still a force to be reckoned with. That is to say, over the next 5 or so years, I can't see that party decaying to the point where they're going to be viable political competitors. I'd probably say 10 years if I was really sort of going out a bit on a limb. So as a party, a political organization, still strong with problems, huge. As an ideology, it's dead. Does the Chinese government still exert a lot of control in various areas? I would certainly say as a first opening statement that that's true. But let me give you an example. Way less now than half of the Chinese GNP is controlled by state enterprises. And in fact, China, if you look at the flow of tax revenue to China, I mean to the central and local governments of China, tax revenue, China gets less revenue out of its economic system than most European countries, and certainly less than the United States. In fact, China's government is so weak it can't get enough revenue out of the system. So in some areas, China's control over the economy, if you were making a prescription, you'd say they need more tax revenue, not less. But in terms of economic output, GDP, China controls, the state enterprises and state control of the economy is less than 50%, considerably less than 50. On capital controls, it's true China has no capital account convertibility, and therefore capital flows are controlled substantially, although there's big leakage. Corruption, if one thing, is moving capital out of the country, and they can't control it fully. But there is capital control, and indeed, most of Asia suffered the Asia financial crisis, but China didn't, because you couldn't move money in and out at will, at least in big chunks. So in that area, there's still control, although it's selective and it calls for a bigger description than I'm giving. But migration, yeah, you can say China has on the books a migration control policy of sorts, but it's infinitely weaker than it was under Mao Zedong, where literally husband could be working in the south, the wife in the north, and the children live in yet a third place, all at state direction. That there are still, rest assured, couples living apart, but it's not because the state directed them, it's because the families have decided to send one son to Guangzhou, another to Shanghai, another to Harbin to earn money. And in fact, you have literally now about 150 million people, let us say 2/3 the size of the United States population, is sloshing around in China looking for work. So if you talk about effective control of the population, in fact, you are seeing the biggest, most rapid urbanization process in the history of the world. That was one of the problems I'm talking about when if I were China's leaders getting up in the morning, how would I deal with the problem? There's a huge difference between what's on the books and what the regime says the rules are and how the system operates. And while you look at the rules and some of its behavior, like to dissidents and one-child policy and all of the things we don't like, the fact of the matter is, in most domains, most of the time, the problem is China's government at any level is not in control. At least I invite you to think about that as the problem, as opposed to too much control. A balanced way to put it would be, say, in some areas they have too much control, in other areas they have too little control, but relatively few areas do they have the right amount of control. That's the way I'd put it. The question essentially was, we are seeing so many Chinese exports in our stores. Made in China is a very common label. Does this give the Chinese leverage to, in effect, declare, I think your terminology was economic war on the U.S.? I think this is, in my view, one of the wonderful things about interdependence. And interdependence means you both need each other. And so in the effort to hurt us, they're going to hurt themselves. Well, let's put it this way. In the economic realm, what's our per capita income? Are we at about 35,000, something like that, just as a rough number? China's less than 1,000. We can debate all these numbers, but that's an order. Let me put it this way. People at 35,000 per capita income have a higher threshold of pain than people at 1,000. And I think that's the last thing on earth the Chinese are going to do. In fact, they were terrified or very alarmed when Americans began talking about embargoing made in China. That's what I can almost guarantee you it never occurred to the Chinese to stop their exports. That would not cross a Chinese mind as a strategy, at least in the current circumstance. War or something, yes. But no, they're afraid that we might stop buying as opposed to them willingly stop selling. I think that's, but the fact of the matter is, even if we tried to use our leverage, I don't think it's going to be very effective. You said, say, computers, and then you said Taiwan. We buy a tremendous percentage of our computers now either are partially or wholly made in Taiwan. And 1/3 of the stuff that goes in those Taiwan computers is made in the PRC. So if we boycott made in China stuff, I mean, are you going to get serious about it? Is one computer chip is that going to be enough to make it not saleable in the United States? Are you going to put your democratic friends of Taiwan out of business? Is that what your proposition is? Or what about Hong Kong? 40% of Chinese exports go through Hong Kong. You want to put Hong Kong out of business? So the fact of the matter is, economic warfare is darn near like a nuclear weapon. It's hard to use it on the other guy without big collateral damage, including yourself. So I must say, as a sort of when I get in my economic mode, I love interdependence because It doesn't mean there can't be conflict, but it certainly gives you an incentive not to have it. I think the core question was, doesn't domestic politics in the United States, both bureaucratic politics and what we might call retail politics, affect this relationship? And are we likely to continually see domestic politics make this a negative relationship? Is that a fair? Now, on bureaucratic politics, it's true. I think in the Bush administration, and I didn't get into that detail, but I think there's a very great difference in the way, right at the moment, that the Defense Department, and particularly Mr. Rumsfeld and his deputy, Mr. Wolfowitz, look at China as a rising power and a potential security problem against which the United States has to acquire the means to deal with it if it's necessary. I don't think, in all fairness to Mr. Rumsfeld or Mr. Wolfowitz, that they've defined China as an enemy, but they've, I think, have defined it as a security problem we have to be prepared to deal with in the future, possibly. On the other hand, I think Mr. Powell at the State Department and the people around him generally are much more in the tradition of engagement, don't overly militarize the relationship, don't place so much emphasis on the military strategic, because you're likely to create the anxiety in China that strengthens the military, that creates the threat that you're afraid of in the first place. So I think there is a distinct view between the Defense Department now and the Department of State. This leads to the question of what does the president think, because you asked how the president can manage this. Well, I would say, and this is one of the conclusions in my book, we pay presidents to lead. And China policy is an area where if the president doesn't define for the American people what our interests are, what our alternatives are, what the costs and gains of different approaches are going to be, and why he's chosen one as opposed to another, then these bureaucracies, not to mention Congress and politicians, are going to have a vacuum, which they're going to fill with all sorts of things. So the key is, I don't think so much what the Defense Department and the State Department think. The question is what George Bush thinks and what he's going to do about it. Now, I think he's learning. But I was quite heartened. If you pay attention to what he said on the day, it was either the day of or the day after the release of the Americans from China. He gave a talk in the Rose Garden, and that talk could have been written by Clinton's speechwriters. It talked about productive relations, desire not to have conflict, right down the track. Now, that's just one straw in the wind. But I think this president can overcome the bureaucratic politics if he has a view and wants to and agrees with it. Now, maybe he'll end up agreeing with the Defense Department when it's all said and done, and we'll have a different relationship than I'm forecasting. I thought there was an interesting article in this morning's paper about Korea policy and George Bush conveying a memo onto his son that essentially argued, you did the wrong thing on North Korea, undo it. And that's the direction we're moving. So I think, I think there's a learning experience here, and I don't mean this in the sense that George Bush knows less than his predecessors. Bill Clinton didn't know nor care much about foreign policy when he started either. So, but you do learn being president, and I'm just putting my bets on that, how he's going to learn, but I could be wrong. Man, just one thing on the partisan politics. You're absolutely correct in the sense that when George Bush was president, the Clinton and the Democratic contenders talked about the butchers of Beijing, and he was soft, and he didn't protect Fong Lijia and all of these things. But the fact of the matter is, they came in, and then you had the change in Congress in 1994, and Mr. Clinton was attacked for precisely the policy that began to be attacked that Mr. Bush 1 had run. So there is a huge partisan dimension to this. And so it doesn't surprise me that the Democrats, and this isn't a partisan statement, say, well, we would have done better negotiating with the Chinese. We got the plane back in one piece. Well, I don't think U.S.-China relations is going to rise or fall on whether we get the plane back in 3 pieces or one. The question is, what do our friends in the Far East think about Tibet, and is there anything we can do about Tibet? I should say I've been to Tibet twice. In fact, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, just addressed SAIS graduation about 10 days ago or so in Washington. I guess the way I'd put it, without putting too fine a point on it, is Tibet is an area twice as big as Texas, a vast area. It has, I will say, and by Tibet I mean the Tibetan Autonomous Region. If you look on a map, something called the Tibet Autonomous Region. There are Tibetans who live outside of that area. And the Dalai Lama has one definition of Tibet that includes 6 million Tibetans living all over, or on a big part of Western China. But the Tibet, at least I'll talk about for this limited purpose, is the one on a map. It's twice as big as Texas and has 2 million people. I think most people in Asia say, you know, it's tragic what's happened in Tibet. And if you go there, you can't be unaware of the desecration, really, of monasteries. There used to be, I think, 13,000 monasteries at one point. It got to a low of about 3 that were really standing at the Cultural Revolution. They're now being rebuilt. So there's a religious revival of substantial proportions in Tibet. But it's tragic what happened. But I think most of Asia looks at it as a very isolated place. Lhasa, the capital, is at 12,500 feet, and much of the country is uphill from there. The fact of the matter is, not a single country in the world, including the United States, since 1949, recognizes Tibet as an independent, sovereign country. Now, Congress has passed resolutions talking about Tibet as a non-binding resolution, talking about Tibet as a, quote, occupied country. And we have I forget the title of the person in the State Department, essentially responsible for overseeing issues related to Tibet. So we've got a kind of complicated policy, but on the basic issue, do we and have we ever recognized Tibetan independence? The answer is the United States has not, and no country in the world does. So in effect, you don't have to limit your view to Asia. You can just say the rest of the world looks at it as a tragic case with a very charismatic, noble, honorable person, the Dalai Lama, as the spokesman for their people, but it is an area about which nobody's willing to go to war for 2 million people at 12,500 feet. I think, I hate to be so, but if somebody wants to characterize it differently, let me know.
In 1980 to 1981, Professor Lampton got the Outstanding Teacher Award at Ohio State University, and I think we would award it to him with great enthusiasm tonight if that were our task. We thank you for an absolutely marvelous evening.